Hi, welcome to this lecture for Assignment 2. I think in the last lecture I divided things up into, for the last assignment I divided things up into 3 smaller lectures. I think I'm going to just steam on through everything for hierarchy in the forest, and I think this will probably be about a 45-minute lecture or so. Don't feel like you have to sit through all 45 minutes at one time. You can break it yourself. But the flow just seemed better with this lecture to just go through both chapters. Now, what I want to do is go through what I take to be the high points in the chapters 6 and 7 from Hierarchy in the Forest, at least for the purposes of the course. I mean, the 6 and 7, they're really rich, and there's all kinds of things going on there. But I have a particular set of issues and things in mind that I'd like for us to explore in this course. And so I'm going to mine 6 and 7 for the things that are most relevant to what I take it that this course is about. And as we've been discussing, this course is about, ultimately it's about human relations, human forms of political relationship, and these features of domination, exploitation, freedom, solidarity, those sets of values and disvalues, and how they might be embodied in different forms of human institutions. But anyway, I think it's very useful to to go way back and try to get a little bit of a handle on some of the anthropological observations, evidence that's been gathered. Might tell us a little bit about human nature and the way in which we bend toward relationships of domination or egalitarian relationships. So chapters 6 and 7, what they focus on 2 questions respectively. Chapter 6 is an extended argument for the claim that humans are basically a despotic species, and Boehm enumerates or marshals evidence for that claim in 6 by setting us in relief with respect to other primates, and then also using this Vehrencamp scale that we've broached last time in the question prompts for last week. Then chapter 7, it's about this countervailing tendency in humans, this drive for parity, as Boehm explains it, describes it in one part. You might call this an egalitarian drive, a tendency toward egalitarianism. So the idea is that humans, interestingly, seem to have this kind of internally riven nature where we can pull one way or the other. And I think the idea that will come out is at least the suggestion that depending upon humans organize themselves and depending upon their place in time and space and geography and technological development, they might organize themselves in ways that tend to lead toward one side of this extreme or the other. That brings out one facet of human nature, the despotic facet, or perhaps they organize in a way that brings that might in other points in time and space and technological development, they might organize in ways that bring out different facets of human nature, maybe this more egalitarian facet. Anyway, let's work through Boehm, see what Boehm has to say, and how Boehm might help us think about these things. At the very end of this discussion, I'm actually going to have a few critical points, or observations, comments about Boehm that should be food for thought and suggest things that I hope we can get clearer about as the term wears on. Okay, so let's just jump in with chapter 6. At the very beginning, Boehm opens up with this spectrum that we talked about last week, Veherencamp Spectrum. This spectrum is sort of a tool. It's a tool that Sandra Vehrencamp designed to help her measure species-specific patterns of hierarchy formation in birds. And I think for her, at least what seems to be suggested in Boehm, is that for her, this was to study different species of birds with the idea that you could array different species of birds along the spectrum. Some species would be more despotic; they engage in characteristically despotic behavior, and other birds, different kinds of birds, would engage in more egalitarian behavior. But now what Boehm has done is he's taken this spectrum and he's sort of adapted it. He's pulled it out of that context and he's applying it to primates and to humans. And as you'll see, things get complicated really quickly because it looks like even primates can organize themselves in different ways, and then they tend to look like things that fall in different places in this spectrum. It's not like birds where pretty much or maybe this is true. I guess we'd have to go investigate and find out. But I think the suggestion is that with birds, pretty much if, robins anywhere, for example, will fall somewhere on the spectrum. And, so maybe eagles will fall in a different spot on this spectrum, but they'll always fall on that spot. Whereas primates and humans, well, it depends. They might fall on different spots depending upon, all kinds of factors. Boehm begins to enumerate some of those factors that might be relevant for us. So let's try to get a little clearer about the concepts that are defining the spectrum for Boehm. As you'll see, at the end of this lecture, I'm going to begin to criticize and push a little bit on the way he carves things up with the spectrum. But let's start with what he says on page 125 about the spectrum, particularly the despotic extreme of the spectrum. So here Boehm says that Vehrerencamp's despotic extreme are animal societies with individuals in a position to exert strong dominance and monopolize reproductive resources. So it looks like there are two elements to Boehm's reconstruction of this despotic extreme. One element is one set of animals within the group that we're looking at will abidingly exert strong dominance over other animals in the group. And I take that to be something really general, just based on reading Boehm and what he says. I take that to be something really general, like there will be one set of animals that abidingly exerts control over the behavior of others in the group. And this could be, over a wide ranging, all kinds of things that they might do. They just kind of keep the other animals in line, get them to behave the way they want them to behave, and they have this ability to abidingly do that. So in a group at Veherencamp's despotic extreme, you see some animals abidingly exerting this strong dominance behavior, controlling behavior of others in the group. But also, and I think a separate dimension for Boehm, is that there's an abiding monopolization of reproductive resources. So there's this general control of others in the group, but then there's also this very targeted, specific monopolization of reproductive resources. That's a key element of groups that are on this despotic extreme or tend toward this despotic side. So now, what are reproductive resources? I think here, just once again, by kind of piecing together little scraps here and there in what Boehm writes, there's all kinds of things. Anything that just lends to the reproduction of the individual who's dominating the others. So it might be mating partners. So you might have a silverback gorilla that's not letting anyone else get near the females in his harem. Food. The silverback gorilla is making sure that he has first access and best access to the food, and maybe the mates that he's pulled within his circle, making sure that they have the reproductive resources. But then another would be territory. You need to get the food. You need to hold a particular territory, or at least for some animals, that's what you need to do. So you see things like this. So it's an ability to just control the reproductive resources, the things that are needed for the individual that's exerting this monopolization to reproduce. Okay, so that's two different dimensions of Vehrerencamp's despotic extreme, or at least the way I read it. Okay. Now, but remember, we've got the spectrum. So I've talked about this despotic extreme on the spectrum. What do we say about the egalitarian extreme? Well, at least the way Boehm seems to set it up, it looks like the egalitarian extreme is basically the inverse. So the primary definition is the despotic extreme, and the egalitarian extreme is, it's characterized by groups of people that don't display the despotic behavior. So presumably what you have here is the absence of features characteristic of the despotic extreme. That's what you have in the egalitarian extreme. One thing to note is that Boehm, nowhere, as far as I can tell, and I've actually read all of Hierarchy in the Forest and looked at the index and tried to find something like this, but as far as I can tell, he never does the thing that you might expect, where you just have like a paragraph or maybe a page clearly defining what you mean by despotic and egalitarian. Rather, he just sort of talks about them and says various things about what egalitarianism is and despotism involves or domination involves without pausing to define it. And so what I've given you so far is just my attempt to look through chapter 6 and 7 and identify the parts that seem to give us at least the kernels of a definition. And I think the case is even worse with his account of the egalitarian extreme because he says a little bit more about what despotism entails, little scraps here and there. But with egalitarianism, he doesn't even really do that. It's just he gives us examples. He gives us a lot of examples, and it seems to just be implicit, what he has in mind. So, for example. One thing that seems pretty clear, he seems to think that groups that are at the egalitarian extreme don't display, the features that are characteristic of the despotic extreme. But then he gives us an example: squirrel monkeys. So he anchors things by saying, well, squirrel monkeys are egalitarians. And then he just describes squirrel monkeys with the idea, I take it, that implicit in this description is what he has in mind by things of the egalitarian extreme. So what does he tell us about squirrel monkeys? Well, he says, look, squirrel monkeys, and he has in mind male groups of squirrel monkeys, are the males within a larger group of squirrel monkeys. They engage in cooperative responses to threats, and they sort of hang out together. They're everyone's wingman when it comes to the sexual investigation of female squirrel monkeys. They sort of do this in a group, and they're not competing or fighting over the females. They just kind of go, they're sexually curious together, I suppose. I'm not sure how that works. I didn't dare engage in a Google search with those search terms. So I didn't know what that would produce. So anyway, but the general idea is that they cooperate. They don't fight about reproductive opportunities. They don't fight about food. They cooperate in response to threats. And in general, there's these very low levels of male-male aggression within the troop, and very low levels in general of aggression within any troop of these cute little guys. So he puts up this one extreme, squirrel monkeys, and he says a few things about squirrel monkeys that I hope gives us an idea of what it's like to be closer to that egalitarian extreme. Okay, so then I think another feature of Boehm's discussion that I should bring to the fore is this distinction between genotype and phenotype. And this kind of complicates the Vehrencamp scale a little bit. Because we could think, okay, we're doing a Vehrencamp scale of some group, and we might use that scale to target a genotype, or we might use it to target a phenotype. Now, a genotype, in other contexts than this, genotype, so I think if you were, in say someone's biology seminar or something, and you use genotype, it'd have a very specific, a more specific thing in mind. This would refer to something more specific than what I think Boehm refers to, because I think for, say in a biology seminar, they would refer to actual genes and this kind of underlying genetic structure. But here I think Boehm wants to be at kind of a higher level of generality or extraction. And the idea is that with the genotype, there'd be something that's a kind of internal disposition or an internal structure that leads like the members of some group or some particular species. It leads them to engage, either in despotic or egalitarian behavior. But the idea is that if we were to measure the genotype, we would be curious about that internal mechanism. Is it a mechanism that just generally leads to despotic behavior as a mechanism that is generally associated with egalitarian behavior. Now, we might distinguish from that the use of Veherencamp's spectrum to measure phenotypes, which is just behavioral manifestations, where we say, look, if a group behaves this way, it doesn't matter what their genes are like or what their internal structure is like, but if they behave in this pattern, we're going to call them egalitarian. If we behave in this other pattern, we're going to call them despotic. When you read the Boehm, sometimes he sort of slides back and forth between these things. Sometimes the idea is that he wants to get at the underlying internal disposition, say, of humans. And then he wants to say things like, well, humans have this despotic internal disposition, but sometimes their phenotype looks egalitarian. He pulls those things apart sometimes. Here for this class, mostly I want to focus on this phenotype, but I do want to say some things about something that'd be like an internal disposition. We'll try to get clearer on that as we go on. But ultimately, the punchline for a lot of the folks that we're going to read, and I think including Boehm, but a lot of the folks we're going to read, is that there is something like an internal disposition in humans on this scale, but it's complicated. It's actually got elements of both parts, which means that we have a kind of being that really can realize or bring to fruition, bring to the surface one or the other aspect of its internal disposition. So Boehm, I think you can see a picture like that with Boehm. When we get to Rousseau, you'll really see a picture like that. And he says some interesting things about all this. Okay, but for right now, for the most part, I'm going to focus on human phenotypes on this scale. But toward the end, I'm going to try to bring us back to something that's more like a genotype, like an internal disposition to despotism or egalitarianism for humans. Okay, so Boehm in chapter 6 brings out this idea of adaptive modification of different groups, different primates. The idea is that you might have a genotype, an internal structure, an internal disposition to behave in certain ways, but then in different environments, that genotype is going to unfold in very different ways, and it's going to have a different phenotypic display. To kind of help us wrap our minds around this idea of adaptive modification, he gives us this example of resource-rich environment baboons versus scarce resource environment baboons, specifically desert-adapted baboons. Same species of baboons, but they behave in very different ways. In a resource-rich environment, claims Boehm, this species of baboons that he's discussing, they tend to organize in these really large groups with numerous males and females. And in those groups, you have a social domination hierarchy that allows higher-ranking males to partially monopolize mating opportunities. And then you get something like coalition behavior among males for purposes of defense. But then in a different environment, in this desert-adapted environment, these same baboons, they disperse widely in small groups where you basically have one male and a bunch of females who are the male's harem. And when in these environments, the baboons actually don't compete amongst one another very much at all, because they're in these dispersed small groups where there's really just one male and a bunch of females. There's little dominance behavior across the males, mainly because they don't have an opportunity to butt heads. The dominance behavior that you see is directed at the females as the baboons try to manage their harems. So the idea is that, look, even primates like baboons can manifest, their genotype can manifest in different ways depending upon their environment. Then this same basic idea applies, this same basic idea is going to help Boehm navigate some questions that he has about human nature. Now, like I said, chapter 6 and 7 are about Boehm poses this question in chapter 6, is there a human drive to dominance? In chapter 7, he poses this question, is there a human drive to parity? He answers yes to both questions. But he considers in chapter 6 at the outset this question whether humans, their nature is actually a tabula rasa, that we actually have infinite adaptive possibilities. We don't have a baseline genotype or internal disposition, where I think Locke's idea would be that humans are capable of just through their rational faculty just impose a different way, whatever way they want of structuring the relationships with one another, so long as they just get it clear in mind what they want to do. Are humans this blank slate? Are they this tabula rasa? And what Boehm wants to say is that no, they're not. There's actually these two drives that tend to pull us in different directions that are characteristic of humans. And so he's going to say, and the way that this relates to this previous notion of adaptive modifications is what Boehm wants to say is that, yes, it's true that you can see many different expressions of genotype, many different phenotypic displays in human, a really broad range, much broader than any other animal. But that's because they're capable, just like other animals, of adaptive modifications of their genotype. And the idea is that we're just a lot more complex than these other animals, but we don't have an infinite array of adaptive possibilities. Rather, we have adaptive possibilities that are constrained and guided by this internally riven genotype that we have, these countervailing drives that we have. Okay, so one thing that Boehm does in chapter 6 to help us sort of understand how these drives in humans, particularly the drive to dominance, he applies Vehrencamp scale to a whole bunch of primates, including humans, and different forms of organization of humans, to kind of place them, to kind of locate them, just to help us see what humans are doing here, how they're how humans in these various categories actually do manifest this basic internal disposition, this genotype to domination. So here in this slide, what I have for you is I have Boehm's array. I kind of went through Boehm and saw where he ranked everybody that he considered, every group that he considered along the Veherencamp scale. And at the top is the most egalitarian. So he sort of anchors things with the squirrel monkeys. That's about as egalitarian as any as this set of groups is going to get. Then there's bonobos, which are a lot more despotic than squirrel monkeys, but not as despotic as hunter-gatherer humans. Then there's what he calls the cephalous tribes, big man societies, sedentary foragers. Then you get human chieftains, and then chimpanzees and gorillas. Primitive kingdoms, and then interestingly, ancient states and modern states he puts as the most despotic. I'm going to come back and try to give him trouble about this last category. I'll be curious what you folks think during the discussion sections about that. But anyway, so he arrays these various groups using his scale. I'm not going to tediously go through every one of these, but I want to go through a few just to kind of bring some of these ideas to the fore and help us talk about them. So let me start with the hunter-gatherers. So one interesting thing is that hunter-gatherer cultures are very reliably highly egalitarian, at least as far as hominids go. Let me just say a few words about what a hunter-gatherer culture is. Boehm actually never does that thing, which I would like him to do, where he doesn't define this particular term. He just sort of assumes we know what it is. But let me just take the stab at saying what a hunter-gatherer culture is. So hunter-gatherer cultures, they developed among the early hominids of Africa, with evidence of their activities going back as far as 2 million years ago. And the distinguishing characteristics of these groups is that the hunter-gatherers actively killed animals, that's the hunting part, for food, instead of scavenging meat left behind by other predators. And they also devised ways of setting aside vegetation for consumption at a later date. That's the gatherer part. And then also hunter-gatherer societies tend to organize in very small, self-sufficient bands. I mean, this form of production of resources to survive is something that that small groups of people do, and it can't really be sustained very well in very large groups of people. So if this is the way folks are going to live, then generally they're going to live in these little small groups. And one thing to note is what Bain has to say about these groups of people, and what we know about these groups of people, comes from really two kinds of sources. There are actually people that still today live in groups like this, and then there's a whole bunch of anthropological evidence of people who lived like this. Pottery shards, arrowheads, and campsites that have been excavated, that sort of thing. Bain in this in Hierarchy in the Forest, his observations actually call on a lot of contemporary ethnographic observation, but there's a bit of the anthropological stuff in there as well. Okay, so here are some key features that Bain notes in Chapter 6 about hunter-gatherers. One thing he notes is that you do see male status rivalry typically for females. Basically, this is like lovers' quarrels. And this is something that actually these small groups are really concerned about, because this can really get out of hand. So you basically have men trying to fighting about particular females, and sometimes this can get out of hand and lead to homicidal aggression. And this is particularly problematic because, remember, these are hunter-gatherers, so they're really good at killing large-bodied mammals. So this kind of aggression, this kind of emotion, can culminate in homicide, because these folks know how to kill people. So anyway, one feature you do see in these groups is this male status rivalry, and one thing that the group tries to do is come up with cultural devices, rules, and such to help this not get out of hand. Another feature of these groups is competition for food is not prominent. They tend to share food, and in fact, they tend to share food. Now, as I mentioned just a bit ago, another feature is these groups tend to introduce codes and rituals to try to inhibit competition for females and the ensuing potentially lethal feud. There's also the introduction of codes and rituals to encourage the sharing of food and to discourage hoarding, or to discourage someone who's a pretty good hunter from trying to arrogate to himself what he's killed, rather than just freely share it with the group. There are norms in place to help prevent folks from doing that. Those norms are actually related to this other set of norms that's worth pointing out. There's introduction of norms, you see this over and over again in these hunter-gatherer groups, to discourage attempts to become a dominant leader of the band. And one way to do that, apparently it's the hunters who are pretty good at hunting that are most likely to try to do this sort of thing. So there's all kinds of norms of ridicule and kind of daisy chopping to kind of bring down or to cut down to size anyone who's getting too big for their britches, because they're able to kill big animals. So you get these codes and rituals in place to help with these different features of the group. And then finally, there's this what Bain calls the reverse domination of deviance with respect to these codes and norms, where a coalition of the community, where the whole community or most of the community acting together, will sanction those who violate the norms, including acts of murder or attempts to assert dominance over the group. So this is very interesting, quite complex package of traits that are characteristic of hunter-gatherer bands. And one of the claims of Bain's book, really interesting claims, is that over and over again you see this little syndrome or this little feature of traits in groups that organize in this way, groups of humans that organize in this way, whether they do it today or whether they did it 2 million years ago, or whether it's hominids doing this 2 million years ago. Okay, so So based on these features, Bain then locates hunter-gatherers as not as despotic as chimpanzees, but heading that direction, more despotic than bonobos. I'll leave it to you folks to go, read the details of why he makes that particular conclusion. But maybe it's just useful to say that it's by virtue of these features that he thinks humans are properly characterized as somewhere between bonobos and chimpanzees / gorillas on the Veherencamp scale of despotism. Okay, now Bain also says, spends a few words talking about ancient and modern states. He talks about a whole bunch of other categories as well. I'm not going to go over any other categories, not in this lecture anyway. But I do want to pause and say a bit about what Bain has to say about ancient and modern states. First, note that Scott, the readings for next time, Scott and Lerner, James Scott, and his chapter from his book Against the Grain, I'm asking you to read, and Gerda Lerner, the first 2 chapters of her book, Creation of Patriarchy, that I'm asking you to read, they say much more about these forms of organization, or particularly the ancient state. Now, one thing I just want to get out there, once again, Bain doesn't clearly state this, and surprisingly, neither Lerner and Scott don't give us this either. Well, actually, Scott does. Scott does give us something, but not in the chapter I've asked you to read. But what I want to make sure is clear for you folks is to have a kind of working conception of what a state is and what these folks are talking about. They're talking about states as opposed to other forms of human organization. A state is constituted by a system of authority and obedience, and this final point, a system where there's effective cooperative enforcement by a subgroup of officials that enables it to exert overweening control over any individual subject who violates the community's norms, because those officials have a near monopoly on the use of force in the group. So the state's a very special kind of form of human organization where that's characterized by these rules of authority and obedience and this effective practice of enforcement of the rest of the group. So everyone's held to these same rules of the community, the laws. We commonly call these things the laws of the state. Okay, now Bain places the ancient and modern state as much more despotic than chimpanzees and gorillas in light of this extraordinary power to dominate, where this power to dominate is understood as the effective exertion of behavioral control. So Bain thinks that, look, he raised his little list of monkeys and primates, and including humans, and on this list you can see ancient states and modern states. They're the most despotic. And look at hunter-gatherers. They're back there almost as egalitarian as the bonobos. Okay, now I want to raise some trouble for Bain's categorizations and some of his concepts. And this should be food for thought in our discussion section and food for thought in our response papers, and hopefully just throughout the course. So one thing I want you to just recall and be clear on about Bain is that he understands domination in terms of 2 dimensions. Not domination, he understands despotism in terms of 2 dimensions. He uses the word domination to refer to one of these dimensions, where he seems to think of domination as simply the exertion of control over others' behavior. Another dimension of despotic behavior is monopolization of reproductive resources. Now, the thing that I wanted to point out that I think causes some trouble for Bain's way of thinking about despotism and his working out an application of the Veherencamp spectrum to humans is that these 2 dimensions can come dramatically apart. And we've seen exactly how that can happen with the hunter-gatherer description. You could have a group that's capable of exerting control, that is dominating others, And it's by virtue of that capacity and the exercise of that capacity that that same group actually does very well on the other aspect of the despotism feature. That is, they use this capability to exert control over others to prevent the monopolization of reproductive resources. So hunter-gatherers, yeah, they dominate others in the group, but it's the group at large dominating would-be deviants so that they don't monopolize reproductive resources. Now, I think the same point applies even more pointedly to an ideal democratic state. A state that makes decisions in a democratic way that basically, let's just assume, as you know, since the decisions are made in a democratic way, basically what they do is they fairly share all the resources. Here we have like an entity, the state, this group of people who dominates would-be violators of these democratic sharing rules. There seems something odd, I think, or something not useful, maybe is the better way to put it, to have a spectrum that places that places the ideal democratic state very far on the despotic pole, simply due to the fact that it's really powerful, is really capable and effective at dominating would-be violators of the sharing norms. It seems like things sort of break down. So to say that hunter-gatherer societies should be classified as somewhat despotic because they have this ability to control would-be dominators, that seems like a problematic way of thinking of the extremes of this scale. That doesn't seem very useful. So I'm a bit worried about Boehm's choice to define despotism in terms of exertion of control of others and monopolization of reproductive resources. I suspect, and I think maybe we might want to talk about whether there might be a more useful definition of this extreme, of this despotic extreme, that doesn't conflate, doesn't put these two things together. Because it seems to, because if we do put them together in that way, it seems to lead to a kind of confusion where we end up grouping democratic states with, say, these really, intuitively despotic states like ancient Sumeria. Anyway, we'll talk more about that, hopefully in discussion sections, and bring this out. I'm going to talk more about, I'm going to keep pushing on this point. Hope maybe it'll become even clearer for you folks as I keep pushing on this point in subsequent slides here. Okay. So one thing we might do is, so one thing I'm going to propose for the sake of discussion going forward is that we might amend our working concept of a despotic state when we're applying Veherencamp Spectrum to trying to modify and adapt it to measuring humans. So my proposal is that, at least as a working hypothesis, our working concept of a despotic state at this point in the course is to think of a despotic state as one in which one group of persons abidingly monopolizes the reproductive resources of others, and also it monopolizes other highly valued objects. And then this working concept of despotic state would sort of sideline this other element of Boehm's categorization. It won't take the fact that a state's really good at dominating its public in the form of enforcing its conformity to certain rules. That won't count towards the despotic nature of the state. It won't be that you're more despotic insofar as you can do that. We sideline that, and we just say, look, we're going to define the despotic state in terms of these features, whether there's a subset in that state that abidingly monopolizes the reproductive resources and other highly valued objects. Now here I have two implicit criticisms of Boehm. One I made explicit just a bit ago in the last slide. The one criticism is like, look, we don't really care so much about the fact that one group is exerting behavioral control over another. What we care about, because this is what we're concerned with when we're trying to understand these phenomena, what we care about is if one group is dominating reproductive resources of others, these things that are really valuable to others. The other criticism that's implicit in my suggested alternative working concept of a despotic state is that I think one problem with Boehm's definition is that it focuses on reproductive resources. But something that's going to become clear very quickly as you read Scott and as you read Lerner is that one thing that the state does, a key reason why their states ever came about, is because there were certain elites who wanted to produce surpluses of goods that only have an indirect connection to reproductive resources. So in a sense, states came into being because there were elites who just wanted to live an easier life. And elites wanted to go beyond merely reproducing themselves as animals. They wanted more stuff than that. They wanted other things that they valued that aren't quite directly connected to reproductive resources. That would be part of it, but it's a lot more than that. There's this surplus of goods that the elites that organized the states were after, and to get that surplus, it turns out they had to, well, basically domesticate and turn a whole bunch of people into cattle that they could control in various ways, like cattle. So what I'm going to propose as a working hypothesis right now, please push back in discussion section and so on, is that we think of the despotic extreme in terms of the abiding monopolization of reproductive resources and other highly valued objects, and that we just throw to the side Boehm's suggestion that a key feature of despotism is this exertion of control over others. Okay. I'll be curious what you'll have to say about that in the discussion sections. Let me say a bit more. Okay, so let me talk now about Chapter 7. The slide says Chapter 6. It should say Chapter 7. The human drive for parity. Here in Chapter 7, Hierarchy of the Force, like I said, Boehm is arguing that there is something like a human drive for parity or equality that seems to be in tension somehow with the drive for despotism. And I'm going to just cut to the chase here and go skip ahead to Boehm's conclusion in Chapter 7. So he says, I hypothesize that in a hierarchically organized, socially labile species that exhibits a substantial degree of status rivalry are both strong preferences to dominate in situations of competition and inclinations to submit or flee. Okay, so here Boehm has this interesting idea that this ambivalence, this kind of emotional ambivalence in humans is key to the human drive for parity. Let me get really clear on this human ambivalence, this emotional ambivalence. The idea is that whenever two competing humans, typically males, are engaging in some sort of conflict, they're each of the parties to this conflict, they're going to be like riven by kind of a mess of conflicting emotions. They're going to want to dominate one another. They're going to be driven to dominate because that's our basic genotype. That's our disposition in these situations. But we're also going to be driven to submit or flee because we're scared. We're fearful that we might suffer harm during this conflict. And so we're this kind of mess of emotions here. And it gives this great example of the chimpanzee's wah bark. The wah, wah, wah. I have no idea if that's what they really sound like. But anyway, the idea is that there's this observation, so chimpanzees have all these different vocalizations, different noises they make. The wah bark is one of them. And it's this really interesting one. They make this wah bark in a number of contexts, but there's one context that is an important one, where you'll have one chimpanzee dominate another, force it to submit. the chimpanzee that is forced to submit will begin with like a really high-pitched, kind of chimpanzee scream, like the really loud, the really high-pitched one. And as they get further away, they'll run away from the thing that dominated them, the chimp that dominated them, and they'll climb the tree. And as they get higher in the tree and further away from the chimpanzee that dominated them, their voice will deepen from the really high-pitched wah, 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 to wah, 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 where it's this kind of ambivalent, like I'm still submitting, but I'm like, giving you a little bit of back talk here. There's this wah bark. So here Boehm's trying to illustrate that even in non-human primates, you have this complex of emotions. And he thinks that humans are like this as well. We have this ambivalence. We want to dominate. We don't want to get hurt. And when we submit, you can still see little vestiges of the drive to dominate as we submit and are in a situation where we can talk back and not get in trouble. Okay, so here Boehm then sort of builds on this observation of this ambivalence in these would-be dominators in species where people generally would prefer to dominate. So his idea is that, so let's kind of walk through this. He says that, look, submitters often would prefer to dominate and hence experience negative feelings when they are compelled to submit. The chimpanzee going up the tree is manifesting its negative feelings as it's talking back to the dominating chimpanzee. Now, he thinks humans have this, and he says this disposition is not one that orients us specifically to equality. So interestingly, he's going to look to our drive to dominate as something that's going to generate, because it's ultimately going to lead to egalitarian behavior. But he says, first, look, this disposition is not one that orients us specifically to equality, but rather it makes us resentful, those negative feelings that we experience when we are dominated, when we're unduly subordinated. A way that he puts it in another passage, the would-be winner, the one who wants to dominate, hates to lose. And unless you were someone who wanted to dominate, he seems to think, then it's only because you're someone who wanted to dominate, who's disposed to dominate, that you hate being dominated. So he says the would-be winner hates to lose. So if we didn't have this drive to dominate, he thinks, we wouldn't be resentful when we ourselves get dominated. And then Boehm says, look, the ingenious invention is to create a society in a way such that no main political actor gets to dominate another. No one gets dominated. So we all want to dominate, which makes us hate being dominated, which then in turn makes us use our big brains to come up with forms of organization where no one can dominate one another. So they see to it, here's Boehm again, as a group that anyone who tries to infringe seriously on this rule is himself dominated. This is Boehm's famous, or maybe notorious, account of a reverse domination hierarchy. He thinks that we do have a drive to parity, but it's derivative of our drive to dominate in this interesting way. We create these coalitions in order to dominate would-be dominators because we hate getting dominated so much. And we hate getting dominated because ultimately we want to be the dominator. I'm not sure I'm fully convinced by that story, but it's interesting. Maybe it's right. Maybe it basically gets it right. But let me try to cause a bit more trouble for Boehm. I'll be curious what you folks think. First, let me say something that parallels what I was saying a while ago. He describes what these egalitarians do, these big-brained coalitions of dominators, of the would-be dominators. He characterized what they do as, he characterized them in terms of domination. And I wonder if it's useful to use the term domination in this context to mean what he basically means here is the exertion of behavioral control. To dominate the would-be dominators isn't to monopolize resources with respect to them or valued goods with respect to them. It's just to control them, to punish them or sanction them for for not following the non-domination rules. So my question is whether it's useful to use the term domination in this context, because using it in this context means that implies that we're thinking of the exertion of control to ensure the cooperative sharing of reproductive resources and other valued goods is dominance behavior. And I'm not sure that's a useful way to carve up dominance and non-dominance behavior. Yeah, we're exerting control over would-be dominators, but what I think the better way to think of that is, yeah, we're exerting control over would-be monopolizers of reproductive resources and valuable goods. I'm not sure it's useful to use this word domination the way he's using it. It seems to conflate these issues. And it seems like there's something very different about a group, something very different and egalitarian about a group that uses its capacity to exert control to sanction would-be monopolizers of resources and valued goods. That seems very egalitarian, and there doesn't seem to be anything despotic about that, anything that you might intuitively think is dominating about that, versus a group that uses its ability to control to monopolize resources or valued goods. That seems to be the key to distinction, not the fact that either of the groups is exerting control. They're both exerting control. What seems to be the key distinction is like what they're using that control to do. The egalitarian group uses that control to preserve cooperative use of resources and valued goods. The despotic group is one where one subset uses the capacity of control to monopolize these things. That seems to be the key distinction, important distinction. Now, to be clear, I don't care how we use the words. We could, use any terms or, noise to refer to those two different groups. But I think what's most important is to use some term to identify and separate out those two different groups. And it's a problem when you use a term like domination to bring those groups together under one umbrella. Okay, at least for these purposes here, what we're trying to do, what we want to understand. Okay, now I even have a little bit more trouble for Boehm. Now here I've just brought back kind of the key steps in his account of domination and how our drive to dominate actually underwrites our drive to parity as humans. So the trouble I want to raise focuses on this middle set of ideas that I brought to the fore from Boehm. It has to do with this middle. I've italicized this middle kind of step in his account. Boehm says, look, the disposition in question is not one that orients us specifically to equality, but one that makes us resentful of being unduly subordinated. The would-be winner hates to lose. Boehm's idea seems to be that a precondition of being resentful of being subordinated is that one wants to dominate the other. And that's something that I'm not sure he's entitled to assert. I'm not sure what his evidence is for that. And so I'll just put this in the form of a question for us to talk about. Is possession of a desire to dominate others a precondition of experiencing negative feelings or resentment when compelled to submit? Or can those negative feelings or that resentment, can it just have an independent source of a drive to dominate? So the question is it really the despotic aspects of our nature that drives the egalitarian aspects of our nature? Is that really psychologically plausible? Or might it be that there's something independent of the despotic aspects of our nature that renders us as creatures who don't like to be dominated? I'll just leave that as a question. And I think that's something that Boehm hasn't adequately added, so I think that question's more trouble for Boehm. Okay, now let me summarize everything with really just a set of questions. And these questions, I think they need further conceptual clarification, and ultimately, hopefully, through this course, we can get better answers to them, but I just wanted to bring them to the fore. First, what is a theoretical useful account of a despotic relationship? And I would also say, what's a theoretically useful account of a non-despotic or an egalitarian or solidaristic relationship? What is the proper way, the most useful way, given our interests, to describe those two poles of Veherencamp spectrum? We've seen Boehm's answer, a relationship in which one party abidingly exerts behavioral control over another party and monopolizes reproductive resources. But I've tried to cause some trouble for Boehm's answer. I have this question about, well, what about effective democracies? Do we want to call those things despotic because they're so amazingly effective at controlling and policing the behavior of others? And then I had this other question, what about the monopolization of valued goods that aren't reproductive resources? It seems like having folks who want to monopolize resources other than reproductive resources is an important part of this despotic picture as well. Okay, so there's one question number one, that I think needs further clarification. We need to get a better account of that. I've offered a working hypothesis. I won't repeat my working hypothesis, but a couple slides back, I've given you what I take as at least a better account of despotic relationships than the one that Boehm's given us. Second question is, what motivates human despotic behavior? Is it that we're hardwired to control, to monopolize reproductive resources? That seems to be a big part of Boehm's answer. But then that would make me wonder about our recurrent drive to monopolize surpluses of valued goods that actually don't have a direct connection to the immediate reproduction of any one of us. iPhones are great, and I want them, and I can get pretty aggressive at Best Buy if someone's buying the last iPhone. But is that drive coming from a need to, it's coming out of my hardwired drive to reproduce myself and to control the resources for reproducing myself? I'm not sure. It seems like there's more to this picture than Boehm's letting on. Okay. Then finally, another question. What motivates human egalitarian behavior? Now, Boehm's given us his answer. We have a hardwired drive to exert behavioral control over others that in turn generates negative feelings, and hence negative feelings when when another person forces us to submit. So my negative feelings when I'm forced to submit ultimately derive from my desire to dominate the person who's dominating me. That's Boehm's basic account, and it's that frustration, it's those negative feelings, the fact that I have those, and a bunch of other folks have those when they're dominated by the apex dominator, that drives us toward coalition behavior so that we can dominate that dominator and avoid getting dominated ourselves. That's Boehm's account. My question is whether this is a plausible hypothesis. Is this desire to dominate our counterparts a necessary motivational precondition of the egalitarian behavior? I'm not sure I'm convinced by Boehm's story here. I'm curious what you folks think. It'll be fun to discuss this on Tuesday actually. Okay, now just a quick preview of Scott and Lerner. Scott has this book. It's called Against the Grain, and he talks about this period of time in early history where folks moved from in large numbers from this hunter-gatherer state to this to forms of organization where people are under the umbrella of some state, some group of persons that has this robust capacity to enforce conforming behavior. Scott points out that, look, the historical record makes it pretty clear that people don't want to move from that hunter-gatherer state to this kind of domesticated state where they're living under a powerful state. And his book's about, well, why do people ever do that? People tend, his observation, or the observation that he relays to us, is that hunter-gatherers actually were quite content and so long as they could effectively meet their immediate needs for subsistence and reproduction. And what he points out is that for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, early hominids and humans were able to just live in this way. And so his puzzle in this book is, well, why did we ever get out of that? Why did we leave that state? Why did we move to a condition where we live under a state with others? The way he's going to describe this is he's going to say, somewhere along the way, we decided to start domesticating ourselves, just like we domesticated plants and a whole bunch of animals. Lerner's she has a similar story to tell. Her book's a lot older than Scott's, by the way. Scott's book came out a couple years ago. Lerner's book came back out in 1986, but she focuses on the relationship between men and women. And she notes how this early state formation that Scott's concerned with, one thing that's really important about it is that it actually set humanity down a road in which one sex, men, abidingly dominated the other sex, women. One thing that she points out is that actually in hunter-gatherer societies, it wasn't exactly necessary. It's not quite right to say that it was perfectly equal between the sexes, but it was much closer to that in the hunter-gatherer societies than it was in these early states. And her thought is that these early states sort of set us down this road where there's been this abiding inequitable state between women and men. So basically, some men, on her account, domesticated other men, and all women. That's what happened very early on and kind of set the grooves for the rest of the history of humanity. Okay, now what I'm hoping in the Scott and Lerner readings is this will help us better understand what is at stake in our designs of human institutions and our forms of organization. And hopefully it'll help us better understand what we are getting at when we use terms such as domination and exploitation, as well as these terms opposites, such as freedom, solidarity, and egalitarianism, to describe these various forms of human interaction and organization. Okay, that was a long lecture. I hope you made it to this point. If you did, thank you for hanging in there with me. And I look forward to talking to, well, some of you on Tuesday. And of course, Katie and Francesco will talk to the other parts of the class. Thank you very much.